Welcome to the Sankofa Pan-African series. Please support us through Patreon and by buying me coffee so we can continue to bring you this series. Subscribe if you have not yet done so. And please turn on your notification buttons so you know when we have new episodes for you. And of course, share our videos with all your contacts.
And so this is from The History of Man. This is the prologue. When news of the ceasefire arrived on December 21, 1979, Emil Kutsia was washing blood off his hands. He watched the rust-colored water slosh up until it almost filled the wide enamel basin, and then he turned off the cold water tap. It did not turn off entirely, and water kept drip, drip, dripping into the basin, as though holding on to a memory. The water gurgled down the drain until it was disappearing swirl. Next, Emil reached for the black plug that was, by some miracle, still attached to the sink. He pulled the plug up by its metal chain and washed it and pushed it in before turning on the hot water tap and letting the scalding water rise halfway up the basin. Without having to look, he reached for the bottle of antiseptic liquid that was under the sink. As advertised, when he poured a cupful of the liquid into the water, it mushroomed into a cloud of purity. He submerged his hands into the water, and his broken skin was thankful for all the many stings it felt. Emil was no conscious pilot, however, and so next he scrubbed his hands with a bar of lye soap until they were raw and red. As he dried them on the once white cloth in the towel dispenser, he decided that this was to be his last day at the Organization of Domestic Affairs. As always, he ignored the rarely used purple pump bottle of lavender-scented lanolin lotion that was stationed between the two taps. He had always felt that whoever had left it on the sink had meant it as a cruel joke. This was definitely not the place for sweet-smelling things. Before he left the room, Emil peered at his reflection in the tarnished mirror above the water basin. His glance was brief as it always was now, and for the first time he noticed how tired he looked. He was weary, more weary of the world than any man in his 50s ought to be. After the bombastic hubris of youth and the blundering determination of adulthood, there was supposed to be a blissful self-assuredness, was there not? Or was that self-assuredness only reserved for a particular kind of man, a man that he had not become?
Emil, was a minor character in a Theory of Flight, is this so nuanced, a character, controversial, but who you have dealt with in such an empathetic way, So how did you approach writing a character that ordinarily should be hated, castigated, like Emil, but you've done it so sensitively without, condoning some of the actions he takes. And I just think I'm intrigued, by how you approach writing about such a controversial figure without condoning his actions. Please share that with us.
I think that you probably know this too, as someone who writes, that it's not your job as a writer to judge your characters. It is your job as a writer to tell their story. And the one thing that we all want as writers is for people to empathize with our characters. That's why we write. That's why we create things. That's why we do. That's why the arts exist, right? We are, as human beings, this is what it means to be human. And so for me, that character shaped, the lives of the people that came before me, my grandparents, my mother. Those kinds of people shaped their lives, determined the laws that govern their lives, determined so many things that shaped my forefathers and my foremothers. And so for me, it was important to understand that, because I also feel that history repeats itself. And if we're not careful, we just go ahead and repeat. So if we don't understand how this could happen the first time, chances are we will do that the second time and the third time. We'll just keep doing it because we
Yeah.
haven't come to understanding how it happens.
Yeah.
And for me, this was a way of actually examining how does this kind of thing happen.
Happen.
Yeah.
Yeah, and which is what a lot of us on the African continent, especially sub-Saharan Africa, we are so blind and deaf and to our history, and the situation most of our countries are in now, we are surprised. And the reason why is because we are not linking it, to our, to our history. It's just brilliant, what you do in your in your works. And then, of course, the societal one of the things that we see in Emil's character is how society structures, and can easily corrupt, even when you start out, with this moral, ideal, and all of that. Please, please help expand a bit more on this theme of the way in which societal structures impact individual morality and its importance to the history of man. And your work, your body of work, actually, so far.
So in the history of man, it is said during the colonial period, and I think there's a way in which we
towards the end of it. Isn't
well, it starts in the 20s, so throughout most of it, but yes, his life comes, towards the end of it. Yes. So we see maybe like 50 years of this period. And Zimbabwe was a settler colony, which is a very different type of colonialism. It's a very direct kind of colonialism. It's a very in many ways directly violent, and all the things that colonialism, you feel it on a very personal level because it's there. And I think what people usually don't say enough is that colonialism is inherently a corrupt system, right? Because it is saying this group of people are better than everyone else. They deserve better. So that's already corrupt thinking, because as soon as you're creating those differences, you're making sure that, the resources of the country are there mostly to benefit a particular group of people and not the whole country. So whatever you're doing is already, not right. And yet, if you're living in that system, it's the norm, right? And so you are just going through life and thinking, oh, this must be how it's supposed to be.
Yes.
And that's what happens to Emil. He's born into it, and it's just like, oh, okay, this is, I just go through life like this. And then at some point he starts questioning what's really happening, right? Because he has come to the point where he is in a position of power, and that should mean something more than he starts feeling that it means. And he does something where I think, he starts out thinking it's going to be for the good of a larger group of people. That's how he thinks. But like we saw in the previous book with Bheki Temba, his idea is co-opted by those in power to do a very horrible thing. And he doesn't have the power to stop it, because all he knows is to follow, right? And all he knows is that this is all for his good. And so he's never actually stopped to question the colonial narrative that says he's supposed to be on top, the colonial narrative that says he's supposed to rule. He has never stopped to question it. And so he doesn't have the tool when this thing stops working the way he thought it was supposed to work at this stage in his life. He doesn't have the tools to actually question it. And then he starts to fall apart. And that's the tragedy of the story that he actually did not have the tools to think through the system. And I think this happens to a lot of us. It happens to a lot of us with patriarchy, for instance, right? It happens to a lot with these systems that we inherit. It happens with capitalism. Most of us are like, oh, this must be how things should be. And
Yeah.
then it's like, maybe not, but we don't know how to
Yeah.
then get out of it most of the time. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's those things. Yeah.
Yeah. And yeah, just like I use capitalism as an example, that settler kind of colonialism, it was so easy for a person born into it, to naturally aspire, towards, you know, propagating it because there's no other in their it's not they can't think, they can't see differently, which is what capitalism has become in the world. Actually illustrates well, a character like Emil born into
Mm,
the system. The capacity to even think that it could be different is so
mm,
diminished, that it
mm,
has to be, an
mm,
extraordinary person,
mm,
which is the way in which we're all living in this world where capitalism has gone crazy.
mm,
And all we're
mm,
doing, is just propping it because we really cannot even think
mm.
outside of the box that
Yeah.
if things could be different,
Mm,
the resources
mm,
of this world can actually be better used for the good of the majority of us,
mm,
without this system that we all worship as the right
mm,
and the only way,
mm.
So,
Yeah.
yeah. And then another thing with your characterization of Emil is this masculine cadence, you know,
Mm,
um, which obviously, you kind of you're picking at, you're critiquing
mm,
um
mm,
the that essence, that masculinity. So again, how did you balance it?
mm,
how did you manage to make it come off, so balanced in the story that
mm.
we don't hate Emil. We know that what he's doing is wrong, and we know why, he is such a messed up character.
No, thanks. There was a time we just assumed a certain kind of masculinity was how men were, right? We didn't question it. We just were like, no, this is what it means to be a man. And I think it's in recent decades that we have come to use terms like, toxic masculinity, understanding how things like patriarchy actually can damage both men and women,
Yeah.
if they're not challenged, if they're not changing, if they're, still. And so, Emil Coetzee is born into a place where to be white and male is to be at the top, right? And there's a certain way in which you perform that. There's certain things you do in order to be the man. So you can't not hunt. You can't not there's certain things you just have to do. And he's good at those things. He plays sports, he's great at hunting, he loves, being out in nature. So he again is the perfect person for the system in his mind because everything is happening the way it's supposed to happen. And he confuses himself when he starts um feeling love for a person and he doesn't know what to do about that, right? So he falls in love and he would like this to be, a very manly thing that he's doing where he's using this person and then moving on. But then that doesn't happen. And that's when he begins to be like, something is off here.
Mm,
Again, he doesn't have the tools, just like he doesn't have the tools to question the colonial part of things. He doesn't have the tools to question the kind of masculinity he grew up with. He doesn't have the tools to question all the things that make him, right? And so he struggles with this other understanding of himself as maybe this person who wants to care and give and share. So he's struggling with that part of being in a relationship. He's also struggling with, the idea that being that kind of man is inherently violent, right? And this is where his life comes to, where he turns to violence because it seems like the logical next step, and it's violence against people, and I think that just seems like, oh, this is part and parcel of being, this colonial master, right? You are at the top, so you are the one who creates order, you're the one who controls things, you're the one who makes sure that everyone is doing the right thing. And if that leads to a violent way of doing things, you're the one who's supposed to do that. And again, because he's never had to question it, he does it. But he starts feeling very icky and bad and wishing things were different because he doesn't want to be doing that. He is, such a product of his time and place, that he doesn't have a means out that the rest of us would consider. And yet, if you read the novel, there are people around him who have chosen other ways of being,
Yeah,
right?
yeah. One of his
He,
friends, what's his name?
yeah,
Yeah.
yes,
Yeah.
Courtney. Courtney has a very different way of being in the world. And so I think, it's because he was at the top, right? He was seen as being the best example of this white male colonizer, that he didn't question it. Emil, that is. And I think
Mm.
that's what happens when you are the thing.
That's yeah.
It's sort of like, in Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart, when Okonkwo is, because he's great, he can fight, he can do this. And it's only when it's like things are changing, and he's like, I don't know who I am. The whole system made me think this is who I'm supposed to be. And now you're telling me things are changing. Who am I supposed to be when things change? And I think that's what happens when you're at the top of things, is that you're not actually given, yeah.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's so poignant, your reference to Coco. Even though he had the example of his father, who was a different kind of man, but it was a kind of masculinity that he rejected.
Didn't want. Yes.
He didn't
No.
want any of that. Oh, it's brilliant.
And same
Um,
thing with Emil, right? He doesn't
yeah,
want to be like his father. He's got
yeah,
examples everywhere where he
yeah,
could be a different kind of man. But because he is the epitome of this type of man that the colonial system seems to want,
yeah,
he's not going to try these other ways, because why would he if that's what the colonial system
yes,
wants,
yes,
right?
yes, yes. So we're gonna go into Quality of Mercy, which concludes the trilogy.